Hello, my name is Buki Fatona. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. Welcome to PHIL-SCI-THEO, an 8-part discussion series on topics in the intersect of philosophy of science and religion. What, if any, is or are the differences between the infinite in mathematics versus in religion?
In many ways, that's the most fundamental question of all, I think, because one of the most striking features of the concept of the infinite is that it does seem to have these two fundamentally different aspects. As soon as people use the word infinite, there's a good chance that your mind will go in one or other of two directions. And it may be that your very first thoughts are mathematical thoughts, and you might naturally think in terms of the endless or the limitless or the boundless. So let's think of the endless in particular. That has natural mathematical associations. We think that there are infinitely many numbers, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., because the process of counting never ends. The sequence of numbers is endless. If space or time were infinite, that again would be a mathematical idea. It would mean that they were unlimited, however large a region of space you consider. There's an even larger one. There's no such thing as the ultimate limits to space. Those are mathematical ideas. But the word infinite is very often used in a more religious context or in a more metaphysical context, where it has quite different associations. You might naturally find yourself thinking in terms of perfection or omnipotence or omniscience, and or self-sufficiency or something along those lines. And so the question immediately arises, what do these two clusters of ideas have in common with each other? Why is it that we use the same word infinity in both cases? Now, to some extent, it's no surprise. The idea of the unlimited has applications in both cases. If we describe God as omnipotent, for example, then we mean that there's no limit to God's power. But in other respects, the two clusters of concepts almost seem to be pulling in opposite directions. There seems to be almost a kind of tension between them. So on the mathematical side, for example, you might find yourself thinking in terms of incompleteness. However far you've counted, your counting will always be incomplete. There will always be more numbers to be counted. On the other hand, in a theological context or a religious context, you're much more likely to be thinking in terms of completeness. God is a complete and perfect unity, or something along those lines. So how are these concepts related? How are these two clusters of concepts related? And I'd I'd love to be able to give you a snappy answer to that question. Unfortunately, I don't think there is a snappy answer to the question. I think there is an answer to the question. I think there are a lot of interesting things that we can say about the issue, but I think probably in this context, all we can do is flag the issue because it's such a deep one and it takes us right to the very heart of the concept of infinity, that it has these two very different aspects.
Mathematician Cantor links God with the notion of absolute infinite. What is absolute infinite as Cantor uses it, and why does it make a link between it and God?
This relates to what we were just talking about, actually, because here we find somebody who's interested in the infinite, both from a mathematical point of view and from a theological point of view. So Cantor was a 19th century mathematician, a brilliant mathematician. He did remarkable work, and in particular, he's famous for the work that he did on infinity. But he was also deeply religious. And in fact, he believed that his mathematical abilities were a gift from God, which would help him to vindicate some of his religious beliefs. So you have both aspects at work in Cantor, this keen interest in the mathematics of the infinite and pioneering work on the mathematics of the infinite, and this deep religious sense of the infinite as well. And as you rightly point out, he talked about the absolute infinite. So let me see if I can give you a bit of an indication of what he meant by that. In fact, when he talked about the absolute infinite, primarily what he had in mind was the infinitude of God, infinity as it relates to God. But the best way to try to appreciate what's going on here is actually to begin with his mathematical ideas. And unfortunately, it's beyond the scope of this interview to go into too much detail. But what I can say, and what was absolutely remarkable about Cantor's work, was that he was the first mathematician who really did serious work on infinity itself. Infinity had always been lurking in the background when mathematicians were at work, but Cantor made it a focus of inquiry in its own right, and that's part of the reason why his work was so pioneering. But not only that, he did something absolutely remarkable, which is he proved rigorously that there isn't just one kind of infinity, that we can distinguish between different orders of infinity or different infinite sizes. And if you say that two collections both have infinitely many members, that still leaves room for the possibility that one of them is bigger than the other, that one has a greater number of members than the other. That was what Cantor established. And he showed rigorously that there are these different orders of infinity. In fact, infinitely many different orders of infinity. There are infinitely many different infinite sizes that we can distinguish. And he introduced infinite numbers to measure how big infinite collections were. But he also came to the conclusion, on purely mathematical grounds, that there were some kinds of infinity that were so big that they were beyond measure. Sometimes you just had to say, there are infinitely many things of such and such a kind, and we can't say precisely how many because it's too many to be counted. And this is a kind of infinity that's so great that it even exceeds all the mathematical power that Cantor had brought to bear on the infinite. And that was the point in his mathematical work at which he was prepared to use the phrase the absolute infinite. Occasionally, he also talked about it as the truly infinite. But basically what he had in mind was a sort of infinity that surpasses all measure, that is immeasurable. And he believed that this was a way into talk about God as well, because when you're talking about the infinity of God, you're talking about something that is beyond measure, beyond our mere finite resources to pin it down. So that was a way in which Cantor tried to establish a connection between his mathematical interest in the infinite and his more religious and more theological interest in the infinite.
So for God, who is in this immeasurable category, is the infinite infinite?
So I think probably the best way for me to try to answer that question again is to begin perhaps with a more mathematical focus. There are different sorts of numbers. I've several times in this discussion talked about numbers, and always what I've had in mind is what mathematicians call the positive integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. But mathematicians, of course, recognize numbers in between these as well. They talk about fractions, a half, a quarter, and so forth. And other somewhat more exotic numbers like pi or the square root of 2. Now, the reason why this is relevant is that it's when you start thinking about these different sorts of numbers that you first come across the idea that there are different infinite sizes. It's not anything like as straightforward as you might expect. In fact, Cantor proved that if you include the negative integers as well as the positive integers, that doesn't give you any more. There's a sense in which it gives you more because you're now including new entities, but it doesn't give you a bigger infinity. There are no more integers altogether than there are positive integers. Those are two collections that are the same infinite size. But if you take into account numbers like pi and the square root of 2 and ask how many of those there are, then Cantor proved, you have to say, well, there are more of those than there are positive integers. What's God's take on all of this? Yes. Now, I think that's a fascinating question, but I suppose my own reaction is that it's a question not specifically about the infinite, but just about the very relationship between God and mathematics. Is God a mathematician at all, or is mathematics something that is fundamentally a human tool? One of the great questions in the philosophy of mathematics is whether we're supposed to think of mathematicians as inventors or discoverers. And of course, that's a massive issue, and there's plenty to be said about it. But if you were inclined to think that mathematicians were inventors, then the question, what is God's take on all of this, may not be much different from the question, what's God's take on bridges or buildings or any of the other things that human beings have constructed. I mean, there are inevitably going to be issues about God's self-understanding as well, if it even makes sense to talk in those terms. But again, that raises some questions in the philosophy of religion that arise anyway. They're not specifically questions about infinity, I think.
That does lead the idea of absolute infinite, and I feel like you have sort of just answered that, is what is the absolute in relation to the infinite? Is that what you meant by the immeasurable, things being in the immeasurable category?
Yes, and I think if we go back to the distinction that we were talking about earlier between the more mathematical concepts and the more metaphysical or more theological concepts, one would quite naturally include the idea of the absolute in the second category. I mean, that would be a term that you would naturally apply to God, or if you were talking about the metaphysically infinite in some other connection, you might well find yourself using the word absolute in that context. So, in a sense, it's a paradigmatic example of one of those concepts that form the metaphysical or theological cluster. What was striking about Cantor's work was the way in which he located the absolute over on the mathematical side as well. And was prepared to say, even in mathematical terms, that some collections were so big that they couldn't be measured. These were collections that had an absolute infinity of members, and that was, for Cantor, that was a mathematical idea. So, we were talking earlier about how one of the big issues is how are these two clusters of concepts related. In some ways, they seem to have a natural infinity. In other ways, they seem to be very different from each other. One of the significant contributions of Cantor to this whole discussion is that we begin to get a sense of how they might be related.